Welcome, everyone. I am Bob Wurzelbacher, the director of the Respect Life Office for the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, and this is our video podcast series that we call Being Pro-Life. Each month, we'll discuss a different topic in the Respect Life arena. We'll hear a personal story from someone deeply affected by that issue. And finally, we'll share ways that you can get involved. This month's topic is capital punishment. Today, we have several guests. Will you please introduce yourselves?
I'm Father Neal Kookoothe from the Catholic Diocese of Cleveland, ordained in 1995. And since 1996, I have been working as a spiritual advisor for a number of men on Ohio's death row, in addition to my responsibilities as pastor of St. Clarence Parish in North Olmsted, Ohio.
My name is Jody, and I spent 22 years on Ohio's death row for a crime I could not and did not commit.
Joe, why don't you tell us your story?
My father died when I was still in high school. So I joined the military as soon as I got out of high school. I went in, I did my 4 years, and then I got out because I thought I was certified as a mechanic. Come to find out I wasn't. And by the time I found out that I wasn't, I had to wait to go back into the military. Well, while I was waiting for the paperwork to go through, I needed a temporary job. I hooked up with these people as a landscaper. On the 26th day I was working for this company, I was actually in my bathroom on the toilet, getting ready to go to work. And the next thing I know, my door's kicked in and I see two guys in plain clothes pointing their pistols at me. And I'm like, oh, I'm dead. Until they said they were police. And then I'm like, oh, okay, fine. I didn't do anything. So I'm like, as long as you're not some robber about to shoot me, I'm fine. Next thing I know, they're pulling me off the toilet, handcuffing me, and throwing me on the ground saying I killed this kid. And I'm like, I don't know who you're talking about.
Right.
September 26, 1988, I'm sitting in jail accused of the most heinous crime there can be, murder of another person. The murder was of a 19-year-old kid. His throat was cut from ear to ear, and he was stabbed 3 times, and he was found face down in a creek. And in a short amount of time, I was convicted and sitting on death row and couldn't figure out what was going on or how it happened or what had happened. I was never in trouble before with the law. I was an honorably discharged sergeant out of the military and didn't have a clue about the justice system. And I grew up on Perry Mason. So I'm thinking, oh, I got Perry Mason for an attorney. Come to find out I had Barney Fife for an attorney. It was truly that bad. I had 2 attorneys. One was running for a mayor of a small town, and the other one just didn't want to be bothered because they're court appointed, and they thought I was guilty.
Wow. So what was the amount of time from your arrest to the conviction?
In 5 months. That was from arrest and sitting there and pre-trials and everything else. But the actual trial itself only lasted 2 3/4 days.
The shortest trial in Ohio history?
Yes, Bob.
So one day you think you're getting ready to go to work, and the next day you're in jail, finding out you're being charged with murder, and within a few months you're convicted and you're on death row.
It's the worst nightmare you could ever think of, and you never wake up from it. You sit there and you think, well, this can't happen. From the time I was arrested, I expected them to come any day and open up my cell and say, sorry, we got the wrong guy, go home.
Right.
Every day, even after I was convicted, I was like, oh, this is going to be no time at all. They're going to see that I didn't do this and let me go.
So, Joe, it's been a long time. So do you have more insight now as to why it is that people thought you were guilty or wanted to believe that you were guilty of this crime back in 1988?
Back then in 1988, the death penalty was relatively new, reinstated since the United States Supreme Court abolished the death penalty, and then they reinstated it in 79. And Ohio didn't get it until 1981 when they put the first guy on death row. So it was pretty new. They were using it more like a weapon. You know, we're going to charge you with capital murder and we're going to go after the death penalty if you don't confess. So they were using it as a tool to try to get people to confess so they didn't have to.
He was an easy target because he was with all of the people involved in the case, including the murder victim, on Thursday night into Friday morning. The murder occurred on Friday night into Saturday morning. And so when they were looking to try to solve this crime, And to get it solved quickly, they said, well, you were with this guy. And what they did was they took 3 days and they merged them into one. And so they could say, well, you were with him on Thursday night where there was an altercation in the bar in the men's restroom, and it was a violent altercation. And so you must have had something to do with the murder. And that was a completely different night and a completely different situation. They arrested one of the guys, a guy by the name of Eddie Espinoza, who is, by the way, one of the actual murderers and is now deceased. But Eddie Espinoza swore out an affidavit at the time that he was arrested. And he gave all the names and all the dates and all the places and all the times. But it did not fit the narrative that the police and the prosecutor were trying to tell. So the police went in and they coached Eddie Espinoza to give different dates, different times, different places, so that it would play into the story they wanted to tell to convict the wrong man. And both of those affidavits are still in the criminal file. You put them side by side, and they were sworn out within 24 hours of each other. They tell a completely different story. So if they had done minimal investigation, they would have discovered a strong motive for another individual to be the perpetrator of the crime.
So, Father Neal, when did you learn about Joe and when did you get involved in his case?
In December of 1998, Joe's mother passed away. A number of weeks after his mother had passed, I was visiting on death row, and I asked the corrections officers if they would let me visit with Joe for just a very short period of time so I could try to bring some comfort and consolation and some closure to his mother's death. And that was my first time sitting down with Joe D'Ambrosio. And that conversation between the two of us was going in two different directions because I was trying to be the spiritual advisor and he wanted me to be the death penalty abolitionist. And so he was saying, I appreciate what you did, but I don't want to talk about my mother.
Because up to this point, I was writing everybody, but no one listens to the dead man walking. But now I have a man in front of me. He's locked in with me. He can't get away. And I'm pleading with him because he's not only a priest, he's a registered nurse, and he's an attorney. And he had to have been all three things to do what he did for me. That's why it's God's providence. If he was only two of the three, it wouldn't have worked and they would have executed me long ago. He's telling me about my mom's funeral and I'm thanking him profusely, but you don't understand. I didn't do this and they're trying to put me where she's at. Help me. Most death penalty cases are huge. They're 15, 20, 25 volumes long. Just the trial itself, each volume's 500 pages. I told him about how short my trial was and that it was in one volume. And that's when the attorney of him kicked in.
When he indicated that we're going to condemn a man to death, and the whole legal process to do that takes 2.5 days and is recorded in one volume, something's unjust right there.
Right.
That's not due process. That's let's hurry and get somebody convicted and move on to the next case.
So, Father Neal, so you visited with Joe. You heard about the lack of due process in his case, so you started to investigate. Let's go back to your part of the story here and what you did and how your skills came into play.
That very day, I asked to take that single volume home with me. And I read it from cover to cover, and I realized that something was quite wrong. This young man, his name is Anthony Clan. Anthony Clan was sliced from ear to ear and stabbed 3 times in the chest. And while the wound was extremely deep, but it did not sever his carotid arteries or his jugular vein. But what it did do is open up 2 large holes in his trachea. And the nursing background comes in here because I worked with trachea patients every single day for 15 years. And when you have a compromised airway, you can't speak. You might sound like this, very hoarse and raspy,
Right.
but you can't speak. And the coroner testified that after this wound was created in Anthony Clan, he was running from his perpetrators screaming, please don't kill me, please don't kill me, please don't kill me.
Oh.
I don't even think you need to be a registered nurse to understand that that's physiologically impossible. As a matter of fact, the coroner also testified that he had 650 milliliters of blood in his chest. So if he was doing anything, he was drowning in his own secretions, but not screaming.
Right.
And I knew that that was wrong. And so from that point on, I said to myself, this is wrong. What else is wrong? And that left me, no investigatory experience, started to investigate his case. And when I started to do that, I found out things that he was telling me were true. But more than that, I discovered things he had yet to become aware of.
So if we're going to tell a short version, this is what you learned, this is what you did.
So the succinct version of it, for lack of anything else to do, one day I went down to the Justice Center here in Cleveland, and I pulled all the criminal jacket of the major players in this story. And the very last file that I pulled was Anthony Clan. And I didn't pull his right away because I thought he's the deceased guy. Why would I pull his when I'm trying to figure out who the perpetrator is?
Right.
I discovered that Anthony Clan was the witness to a rape in May of 1988, the rape of a man by the name of Christopher Longenecker. And Anthony Clan was his roommate. And Anthony Clan walked in while the rape was in progress. It allowed Christopher to escape, to go to the police, to report the rape. And then the very next day, the rapist, a man by the name of Paul, nicknamed Stony Lewis, is arrested. Now, Stony Lewis has a long criminal history with drugs. He has a previous rape charge, so he sits in county jail for the summer of 1988. And Christopher Longenecker gets a subpoena that he needs to show up for a pretrial hearing. And while he's blind, he can read like this. And so he shows up for the pretrial hearing on August 11th of 1988, but he had misread it because of his blindness. He was asked to be there on August 1st. And because he did not show up on the appropriate day, they released Paul Lewis into the community for want of prosecution. If he goes to prison for rape again, he's going away for a long, long time. The only witness to the rape shows up dead, and the rapist points his finger to Joe.
Wow.
And the funny thing is, the prosecutor in the rape case was my prosecutor in the murder trial. And he never disclosed the rape to us at all, even though they called Stoney to the witness stand against me.
So the prosecutor himself was clearly aware of this other case, and yet did not seem to be interested in disclosing that or trying to get to the bottom of why there might be a connection between these two cases here.
So I was through with my state court appeals, and I was just starting my federal appeals when Father found the information out about the rape. When we brought that to my federal judge, the federal judge granted us wide discovery. Because if they're hiding this in their files, what else are they hiding?
Right.
So they turned over the prosecutor's file, the police file, and the coroner's file. And 80% of the evidence that freed me was in those three files. And they hid it from me. But what they would do is they would give me a 5-page police report and only give me page 1 and 3 because the other 3 pages had information on it that would help me. And finally, the federal judge said, we have to have a hearing. And the hearing actually lasted longer than my trial did. We had a 3-day evidentiary hearing. And with that evidentiary hearing, she overturned my case and my conviction.
It's justice. You know, I get people calling all the time asking me to do for them what I did for Joe. I didn't do anything for Joe. I stood by his side, but the evidence freed Joe. It wasn't me.
So, Joe, you know you're innocent. Your life has been more than turned upside down. You're on death row for a couple of decades. You're learning that prosecutors and lawyers aren't always as dependable as you might assume they had been before you went through it yourself. Who knows what kinds of questions are going on in your head? Why, God, is this happening to me? You know, your family is getting estranged from you. How did you keep your hope alive and keep this fight alive for all this time after all of this that's been going on?
Well, Bob, a lot of it was my faith, and I kind of got flack for that a lot of times because guys were sitting there and like, you're on death row for 10 years, 15 years. How can you pray to this God every day? Do you believe this guy? There's such a thing? And I was like, yes, I do, because we're on God's time. Right then and there, as soon as I was arrested, I wanted to be freed. But God had a plan. And God's plan was that I go through this so I can then come out and testify to this firsthand. And yeah, okay, it took 22 years. But to me, it makes the story stronger. If I spent a year so it was a year, oh boy. When I tell you I spent 80% of my adult life on death row for something I didn't do, that makes people stand up and pay attention.
So, Joe, real quick, obviously, when most people get out of jail after 24 years, there's not a whole lot of hope for job placement in that situation. But Father Neal, in this case, apparently hired you. So what are you doing now? What do you do for the church?
Luckily for me, he has a giant parish with rental properties on it that they rent out. And I'm a jack of all trades and a master of none. So I can do whatever he needs to be done. And thank God for that, because by working for the church, I have benefits. I have a steady job where most guys don't have anything when they get out.
So Joe and Father Neal, so now we know a little bit more about this issue. We know more about the possibility of people being convicted wrongly and being on death row. What can people do to get involved in this issue?
Well, thanks for asking the question. I think we have a state institution here in Ohio, Ohioans to Stop Executions, who literally does a lot of that education piece for us. And it does a lot of legislation and advocacy for us as well.
As you can see here on the screen, otse.org is where you can find Ohioans to Stop Execution. This will keep you up to date on what's happening in the state of Ohio concerning the death penalty. And then related to that, I'm sure you can contact your legislators when things come up, whatever it is.
Warren, he's one of my guys that I work with, and he's the next guy to be executed in the state of Ohio. Keith is up September 12th is his date. I'm hoping that date doesn't go forward either, that we still have some time to work with Keith.
Keith is actually the guy that was in the cell next to me.
There's another group called Witness to Innocence. It's a group of death row exonerees like Joe. They do also advocacy for death row exonerees and education for the communities.
We can find that at www.witnesstoinnocence.org.
You can go on to one of the links, I think it's under Who We Are, and then there are a number of exonerees there. And you can invite an exoneree into your faith community, into your civil community, learn firsthand one of the stories and what they've been through and how their lives have been altered by the death penalty. If you're here in Ohio, give Joe a call. He's willing to come in and tell his story firsthand. And then, if you want to get more personal with this, you could easily write to a death row inmate, start a pen pal relationship, and literally hear somebody's stories. It changes the picture altogether, that these people in prison are not the monsters that the state would have them appear to be. This is not a necessary punishment. We can accomplish the very same things, keeping our streets safe, our families safe, our neighborhoods safe, by putting people in life in prison without parole. We don't need to be executing somebody to do this.
And actually, it's more of a punishment to stay in prison than it is to be executed.
Well, there's some truth to that, because life in prison is a horrible prospect for them. Many of them, including Keith, says, if I'm going to get life in prison, I don't want it. I'd rather have the state execute me. But life in prison is not something that they really want.
It's not fun.
So I think most of our listeners hopefully all agree that if someone is innocent of the crime, they shouldn't be convicted, shouldn't be in jail, shouldn't be on death row. But for those who would say that, okay, if you're guilty, if you really have killed someone, then you should be put to death by the state. What is your response to why that's not a solution that we should be doing today?
So that's a good issue to look at. But when you consider that less than 1% of murderers are subjected to the death penalty, it loses all steam as an argument. Most murderers are given a sentence of a term of years and then parole. So they're coming back out onto your streets anyway. What they want you to believe is that these are the monsters, that these are the worst of the worst, and so we'll execute them. But that's not the case. In order to get the death penalty in Ohio, you are subjected to one of 12 aggravated circumstances. And if you don't have one of those aggravated circumstances associated with your crime, you're not death penalty eligible. So many people whose crimes are much more heinous are sitting out there in general population with the opportunity to eventually be released.
What's just one quick example of what's an aggravating circumstance and what is one that doesn't qualify as one that's clearly worse?
So, for instance, if you have what they call felony murder, if you murder in association with a kidnapping, another felony as a background, then you're eligible to the death penalty. The murder of a corrections officer, a police officer, you're eligible for the death penalty. But if you're just out there and you've got a vendetta and you got a gang shooting and there's no underlying felony associated with it, a drive-by, boom, you're not going to be eligible for the death penalty.
And the sad thing is, there's no rich people on death row. There's no well-educated people on death row. It's the lowest of our society who's on death row. To say it's the worst of the worst on death row is a lie.
It's the poorest of the poor, the people who don't have the resources to get the justice system, either to find them innocent if they are, or at least to have a conviction that does not include the death penalty. Is there anything that you think needs to be said real quick and have before we go?
If you want a better explanation of my case, if you have Netflix or YouTube, go on there, punch CNN Death Row Stories, Season 1, Episode 3. That's my episode. It'll explain the case very well. They did a very good job.
Okay, so CNN Death Row Stories, Season 1, Episode 3. So is this it right here?
That's just the trailer, not the actual.
But you can get it on YouTube or Netflix. That's it.
Very good. Well, this has been very educational for me. I imagine for our listeners as well. Thank you for giving your time on capital punishment today. As both John Paul II and most recently Pope Francis has called us to call that inadmissible, unacceptable, unnecessary, the different words that have been used recently by popes about capital punishment, that we do not have to kill someone in order to protect society anymore.
I want to thank everybody for listening to us and to hearing our story, and for your interest in the death penalty and capital punishment here in Ohio as well. It's heartening to know that people are concerned.
And get involved. Thank you for having us.